The war begins, of course, when the Germans invade Poland on September 1st, 1939, and the war would last about 6 weeks in Poland. It would not take the Germans very long to conquer Poland, and the only holdout was Warsaw, held out for several weeks, and that was sort of a different kind of warfare because it was, urban warfare, siege warfare. So that took a little longer, but basically, 6 weeks tops. And Poland gets partitioned between the Soviet Union invades Poland from the east, Germany invades Poland from the west, and they divide it basically along the line of the boundary between Germany and Russia before World War I. So they just erase Poland and go back to it.
Were there any times like an attack on a city was repelled? Or if there was a targeted attack on a specific city like Warsaw, was it pretty much guaranteed that the city would fall?
No, Stalingrad. Actually, let me talk about modern warfare for a second here. World War II, the combat in World War II is going to be fundamentally different than the combat in World War I for one very specific reason, and that is that World War II is an entirely mechanized war. It's fought with trucks and jeeps and motorcycles and tanks and airplanes, and it's got a series of weapons that solve the problem of World War I. The problem in World War I was that they had these fantastic defensive weapons, machine guns basically, but they didn't have any good offensive weapons. They didn't have any good weapons that would allow them to attack effectively or to project firepower at a specific spot on the enemy's lines over there. And I mentioned that essentially the only way to attack in World War I was to get tens of thousands of guys to jump out of the trenches and run through no man's land and attack the trenches with infantry. They did develop the tank in World War I, but it was not a really effective weapon. It was too slow, too clumsy, wasn't heavily armored enough, etc. So it really didn't have a big effect in the war. The airplane was there in World War I, but it basically could carry machine guns and the occasional hand grenade, but it could not carry even a 50-pound bomb, and so you really didn't have serious bombing, and so airplanes could strafe, but they were not a major factor in the war. World War II is totally different because of the airplane and the tank for the most part. The Germans, there's an old saying that every victorious army is ready to win the last war. And what that means is that if an army wins a war, they tend to think they've figured out how to win wars, and they don't innovate much before the next war. They're like, the last war will go the same way and we'll win. Whereas if an army loses a war, they generally say, what did we do wrong? What do we have to change? How do we have to remake ourselves to win the next one? And so after World War I, it was Germany that did most of the innovating because the German military was like, we lost, what did we do wrong? How can we win this one? And part of their response is, which I'll talk about in a minute, is that we need to strategically not fight a double war against two foes, right? We don't want to fight two sides again. That was a problem. But tactically, the Germans spent most of the 20s and 30s saying, what can we do differently on the battlefield to win in the battle? And they came up with what they called Blitzkrieg, which means lightning war in German. Krieg is war and Blitz is lightning. So Blitz and the reindeer is in fact named lightning. The Blitzkrieg is, let me start this way. In World War I, suppose you've got a whole bunch of infantry along in a trench, right? And I'm just doing these as units. We call it regiments or something. And you would have machine gun nests. So if you were the Germans and you wanted to attack, the problem in World War I was that you would have to send infantry from our trenches into the enemy and charge right into the machine guns. And so the French and the British basically said, between the wars, they developed a tank, right? And so they had tanks tanks got much faster, they got much more maneuverable, they got much more powerful, but they also got turrets on top of them and they got cannons. So tanks now became a pretty powerful weapon. They're bulletproof, they can travel pretty well, they have a big cannon on them, and so you can attack with a tank. However, the French and the British did not see it that way. They had a very limited understanding of this. They basically said a tank is meant to take out machine guns. So if we're going to send 1 million troops running across no man's land, what we're going to do is give each unit one tank so that if they need to attack machine guns, they've got a tank to go and attack that machine gun and take it out so the infantry can go. So they basically said we're going to have the same battles as World War I, we're just going to have this tank that can take out machine guns, so it's going to be more effective. Is everyone with me? So what the French and the British did was they tended to assign a tank or a couple tanks to every regiment or I'm not sure on the exact numbers, but to every set of military units, they would assign one tank, so they would spread out their tanks. But the Germans realized that the tank and the airplane by 1939 had a far bigger importance and it essentially transformed warfare. Because the Germans realized that if you're facing the French and they're lined up like that, the best way to handle this is not to put one tank here, and one tank here, and one tank here, and one tank here. The best way to handle that is maybe you put 200 tanks right here. Because the whole point is you want to break through their lines, right? And so what the Germans do is they put a whole phalanx of tanks, a whole column of tanks, maybe up to a couple hundred tanks. They pick one spot on the line they're going to attack. And then they bring in dive bombers. Anybody know what dive bomber is? Everyone know what dive bomber is? Imagine a fairly small airplane. It usually has two people, so it's not one of those big bombers. It carries one 500-pound bomb. Now, 500-pound bomb is a significant bomb. I mean, that's a significant amount of explosives. And what a dive bomber does is it flies along at 30,000 feet or something like that, and then it picks a target on the ground, and then it dives at the target. The pilot basically pretends he's going to fly his airplane right into the ground at what he wants to hit. But then when he gets down to 10,000 feet or whatever, it depends on the airplane, etc., he's diving at the ground and he lets go of the bomb, and then he pulls out. And the bomb goes exactly where he was aiming the airplane. So basically he can just aim the airplane at whatever he wants to hit, let go of the bomb, and the bomb will continue on that trajectory and hit whatever he was aiming at, right? Now imagine you have 30 or 40 dive bombers that come flying along, and they've picked this spot right here, and they dive one after another, dropping 500-pound bombs on that spot, right? And a 500-pound bomb is enough to take out a tank, no problem. So you drop 30 or 40 500-pound bombs right there, and then you drive 200 tanks through the hole, right? So what Blitzkrieg is you pick a spot, and it's like you hit it with lightning. You just bombard this one spot with massive amounts of explosives, first from the dive bombers and then from the tanks, and you just plow right through, and you concentrate all your firepower in one spot and plow through the enemy lines. Then, and this is the key part, the normal military strategy says that if you break through the enemy's lines, what you do is circle around behind and attack the enemy from behind because they're not ready to be attacked that way, and you can cause their whole line to collapse, etc., and make a big hole. But the Germans realized with Blitzkrieg, that's not what you're going to do. This is a war of motorized vehicles. They go 30 miles an hour. And so rather than spending your time turning your tanks around to attack the enemy lines, these guys are all infantry. Why don't you just drive through their hole and then keep going? Why don't you just say, all right, we're through the French lines, we're just driving our tanks straight to Paris. Okay? And then it becomes a race. Can your tanks catch up to my tanks? Because I'm flying now. I'm going full speed, and I've got my troops in trucks, and I've got jeeps, and I've got motorcycle scouts, and I'm just flying as fast as I can, and I've got airplanes blowing things up ahead of them. I can just keep going, right? And then your job, I mean, early in the war, what happens when you get this kind of breakthrough is that this army would try to get back around in front, and they can't do it because they're going too fast, right? And so then it becomes literally just one army chasing another one, and all discipline and all formations break down, etc. And the 200 tanks basically carry the day. Everyone looking at that?
I know the Nazi leadership did a lot of drugs. Wasn't like meth standard issue for the panzer divisions for the Blitz?
Yeah, well, there were a number of pilots also. We're basically given methamphetamines. Yeah, they were.
Party.
Yeah,
Don't stop.
a lot of basically the German army realized they were at various points in the war, especially middle of the war, realized they didn't have enough people, and so the way you multiply your force is simply have your pilots going 24 hours a day on meth rather than having them sleep, and then you need more pilots.
Smart.
Sort of.
If you need more manpower, delete sleep from the equation.
Any questions about what Blitzkrieg is? So the parts of it are you concentrate firepower on one spot, break through the lines, and then you go. And you race so that it turns into a race instead of being a slugfest, right? The Germans basically had tried this out in the Spanish Civil War. In the Spanish Civil War, which is 36 to 39, two sides have been fighting, neither side was very well armed, and so the Germans had simply picked the fascist side of the Spanish Civil War and said, we will help. And what they did was they sent over tank crews and dive bomber crews to basically do live ammunition training in the Spanish Civil War. And so they rotated virtually the entire German Air Corps through Spain, all while denying they were doing it. Yeah. And then, so they all got real live military action in a real war. And so when World War II started, they knew they had refined Blitzkrieg tactics. They knew what they wanted to do, and they basically had an enormous tactical advantage over everybody because nobody else knew what the heck this was, and nobody else was ready for this. And it would take until about the middle of the war before everybody figured out how you handle this. Any questions about that?
What were the counter things that? Because I assume that they implemented counter strategies to that
Yes.
pretty quickly.
By
So
the Battle of
what
the
was
Bulge
it?
is the good way to is the key example of this. In December of '44, the Germans launched a major offensive around Bastogne in Belgium, and they broke through the American lines, and they started to move towards Paris, as they were supposed to do, and they had a major breakthrough, just totally overwhelmed the American military. But the Americans, by that time, had realized that the way to handle this is you don't go racing over here and try to get ahead of them. You simply launch a major counterattack right here, and you cut them off. So they don't get any more relief soldiers, they get no more ammunition, they run out of gasoline. Yes, they're a problem while they keep going, but they are a limited, isolated problem now because you've closed the gap behind them, you've closed the door, and nobody else can follow them. And so it's not a major breakthrough, and that's exactly what they did at the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans basically pushed the front line like this, and the Americans cut it off there, and the German army is stranded. So that's how you handle Blitzkrieg, if you do. Questions about that? So the first time this gets used in World War II is on the Poles, and the Poles don't know what hit them. The Poles actually had the Poles actually had one really brilliant airplane designer, and they had some of the best fighter planes in Europe, but they totally didn't have. I mean, the Poles are actually the Polish cavalry was actually men on horses, not men on tanks, which is what cavalry usually.
Tanks, yeah.
They had some tanks, but not enough, and they were still using cavalry.
Yeah, I
units,
think
so,
if you're riding in on horses and you're faced with just as many tanks,
it's a problem.
yeah. I mean, horses I don't think do good against tanks, probably.
They do not. Not only do they tend to shy away from them, they tend to crush easily. So the Germans launched a blitzkrieg attack on the Poles and overwhelmed the Polish army.
So it seems like if they they have a lot of tanks close together, that would be a massive target for bombers.
It is, and
So
part of
how
it.
do they deal with that? Because as you said before, like a single a 500-pound bomb could like easily destroy a tank.
Right. Basically, they don't know where it's coming. This becomes one of the cat and mouse games over the whole war. Is that reconnaissance airplanes are trying to figure out where the enemy's going to attack, and so if they see 200 tanks being amassed, they're like, okay, that's where we want to hit before they attack. They're going to attack there. Let's go in there and with our airplanes and get them. But then the other side has covering, air cover to try to shoot down the airplanes, to try to shoot down the tanks. And what really emerges out of this is that tanks are sitting ducks to airplanes. So if you want, but tanks are really effective against infantry. They're really effective against fortified positions, etc. So you have to have your tanks protected with air cover, and you need airplanes that are flying close over the tanks to fight off any other airplanes that are attacking your tanks, because airplanes will destroy the tanks. But if the airplanes can't get there because your airplanes stop them first, then they can't destroy your tanks. And also the matter of surprise, right? So you try to disguise where your tanks are. You camouflage your tanks, etc. So it becomes a cat and mouse game, but airplanes trump tanks, and not to be too. I don't think this is a big spoiler, but in Saving Private Ryan, you'll see that.
When exactly is radar invented?
They have radar in World War II.
Okay.
In fact, the last scene, right when I stopped Saving Private Ryan, they had come into this field and like, what is that thing? And he says, it's a radar array. They had radar. Both sides had radar. It was not perfect,
Right.
but they actually did have radar, and they actually had airplane-mounted radar. So I'll talk about the Battle of Britain in a minute, but the Germans were bombing England at night, thinking there's no way they could shoot down their airplanes, but the British had airplanes equipped with radar, and they could actually fight in the dark, not being able to see anything. And the British developed an airplane called the Black Widow, which was all black and fought only at night and had radar and, et cetera. Any other questions?
So that's why, like, during the bombing campaigns, like people in the cities would like turn out their lights or the black curtains.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So that was to basically make it so that airplanes couldn't see the cities.
Yes, exactly.
Because they weren't using radar to.
The radar that they had wouldn't show them where a city was.
Okay.
Because when you get low enough with radar, it just says everything is a blip, So you basically have to. Radar is only good down to 100, 200 feet or something, and cities. Most of the European cities do not have tall skyscrapers, etc. So you couldn't find a city with radar. You had to just say here, and they didn't have GPS or anything. So those pilots had a navigator. The bombers had a navigator who had to estimate. Wind speed, air speed, etc. And it's really hard for an airplane to know how far you're traveling over the ground, because you might have a headwind, and so they have airspeed indicators which measure the airflow past the airplane and say, oh, it's 200 miles an hour, but it might be a 20 mile an hour headwind and you're only going 180. And so they really don't know. It's hard to figure out where you are, and so if you black out a city, there's a good chance that the airplane simply will miss it and drop their bombs somewhere, in the countryside, because they can't tell city from countryside if you black it out. So that's the idea. But if it's lit up, they obviously there it is. Right, so. Any other questions, comments? All right. So Poland falls in about 6 weeks, and as I mentioned, Britain and France had both declared war on Germany on September 3rd, because they'd realized Hitler's just going to keep taking stuff until we stop him. A war is inevitable, so they had a treaty with Poland. We'll defend Poland. So as soon as Hitler invades Poland, Britain and France declare war on Germany, but they're not ready to fight. Because I mentioned that
Declared war, but not quite ready.
Yeah. Poland basically falls, and the Germans spend, much of the fall, October, November, December, basically just establishing control of Poland. Right? They gotta mop up all the French or the Polish military units. They've got to, they got to take over, send German units to every city and et cetera, establish control, and it takes a while. So Germany is occupied with sort of processing Poland, if you will. And France and Britain aren't doing anything. And this period is called the drôle de guerre, the joke of a war, which is essentially...
This would have been like the perfect time for France or Britain to launch an attack.
Oh, absolutely. But they didn't. So essentially, for like 6-7 months,
Oh, that's actually a lot longer than I thought.
nothing's happening. And as I mentioned, one reason for the drôle de guerre is that the British don't have a big standing army. They have a couple 100,000 soldiers, but do not have millions of soldiers in the army. So the British immediately start doing a draft. They start training soldiers. They got to crank up war production, etc. The British have to get ready. So the British send whatever military force they have, which is several 100,000 men, over to France to back up France. The French, for their part, as I mentioned, are sitting behind the Maginot Line. And the Maginot Line, as I said last time, was this line of fortifications along the entire German-French border. It was deeply embedded bunkers, tunnel systems, super high reinforced concrete bunkers that would handle, airplane bombs, etc. It's basically an impervious line. There's no way the Germans are getting through the Maginot Line. Yeah.
I know you mentioned last time that obviously they didn't put the Maginot Line on the border with Belgium, but I feel like after the First World War they could have politely asked to collaborate with Belgium and put a Maginot Line on Belgium.
They did actually. Belgium had its own version of the Maginot Line, but for various diplomatic reasons, Belgium had broken off its cooperation with France in like 1938, and so they had that idea. It just hadn't quite worked out for various political reasons, and so Belgium had a bunch of fortifications. France had a bunch of fortifications. Neither one of them had fortified the Ardennes forests. So. Questions about the drôle de guerre? It's called the phony war in English. The English called it the phony war.
So basically, Germany steamrolled Poland, and then France and Britain said, "I guess we'll hang out until you start attacking us."
Yeah, because basically the French and British thought, if we can just get the Germans to bash their heads against the Maginot Line, they will take horrific casualties and we won't. And that's how we want to fight the war. So they basically just sat there waiting for the Germans to attack. Germany, however, had learned one of the lessons of World War I. In World War I, the German and British navies had one major naval battle at Jutland in 1916, and it had been inconclusive. But as a result of the Battle of Jutland, the German Navy had basically gone back into port and sat there for the rest of World War I because they didn't want to have another battle like that was inconclusive that cost them a whole lot of ships. And so the British sort of controlled the North Sea and the English Channel, and that allowed the British to cut off Germany from the rest of the world. Because if you look at the situation, the geographical situation of Germany, Germany has all this coastline along the Baltic Sea and some on the North Sea, but if the British just put a line of battleships across here and a line of battleships across here, Germany can't go anywhere, right? The Baltic Sea is a dead end, and so they really have to sail past England to get anywhere to the rest of the world. And in World War I, the British had successfully embargoed Germany and cut off Germany from the rest of the world, and Germany had severe food shortages as a result of that. So Hitler and the Nazis are like, well, we're planning World War II. We know what we want to do. We're going to start it on our terms. And so they had realized the way to handle this, they probably couldn't. The German Navy wasn't powerful enough to break through that line in the Second War. But if they could take Norway, Norway extends all the way, has all these fjords and fantastic ports all the way up to the Arctic Circle, hundreds of miles. It's like 1,000 miles. There's no way the British can put a cordon around all of Norway. And so the Germans basically said, in order to avoid being cut off, the first thing we have to do is conquer Norway. Well, how do you get to Norway from Germany? Well, the answer is you invade Denmark. Right? You invade Denmark, and then it's a quick hop by ferry over to Norway, and then you can invade Norway. So in April of 1940, the Germans, much to everybody's surprise, because neither Denmark nor Norway had declared war on anybody, the Germans invade Denmark. It takes about 3 hours. The Danes are like, we can't stop you. So we're not going to die trying. So the Danes basically just surrendered, and then
Please don't kill us all.
and then Norway decided to fight, but they were totally unprepared for it. The British tried to send help to Norway, but it was a total chaos. There were actually instances where the British were like, okay, we'll land a bunch of ships at this fjord, and they show up and they find out that 2 hours earlier the Germans had decided to land a bunch of ships at that fjord, and so it's like, oh my gosh, the Germans are here first. So it turns into it's about another 6 weeks. For Norway holds out for about 6 weeks, but they really can't hold out very long. Any questions about that? So the Germans have said, okay, we've taken care of that problem from World War I. We won't be embargoed because now we've got Norway and we can avoid an embargo. The next question is, can we take out France? And Germany is like, we've got to take out France and Britain before we attack Russia. Remember, Hitler's big goal is to conquer Russia and conquer Lebensraum and create a sort of a slave plantation system over there. But to do that, he doesn't want to have to fight France and England on the Western Front, so to speak, like they did in World War I. And so he's like, I've got to knock France and England out of this war before I attack Russia.